Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where winter wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a season-long death sentence that you might not survive. Picture this. You're standing in a medieval village as November's chill creeps across the landscape, watching the last stubborn leaves surrender to an inevitable frost. The air carries that sharp bite that makes your lungs ache, and you know with the certainty that only comes from experience that the next 6 months will test every survival instinct you possess. You probably won't make it to spring if you're unprepared. And unprepared in medieval times meant something as simple as not having enough firewood or storing your grain poorly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop that in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake on a November morning in the year 1347, and the world outside your tiny cottage window looks different than it did just days before. The fields that once waved with golden grain now stretch out like a brown, stubbled beard across the landscape. Your breath fogs in the air inside your home, never a good sign this early in the season. The straw beneath your feet crackles with a brittleness that wasn't there in October, and when you step outside, the ground gives that peculiar crunch that tells you the earth is beginning its long, hard sleep. This is November in medieval Europe, and you're about to embark on what historians call the hungry gap, that brutal stretch between the last harvest and the first spring greens. But calling it a gap makes it sound temporary, like a brief intermission. What you're actually facing is more like a prolonged siege, where your enemy is time itself, and your fortress is whatever food, fuel, and shelter you managed to scrape together during the warmer months. The transformation happening around you is both beautiful and terrifying. The oak trees that provided sweet acorns for your pigs now stand bare, their branches reaching skyward like desperate fingers. The streams that bubbled cheerfully through summer are beginning to slow, developing that sluggish quality that warns of ice to come. Even the birds seem to understand what's happening. You notice how the smart ones have already disappeared, leaving behind only the hardy crows and the foolish sparrows who think they can tough it out. Kind of like the people who insist they don't need a coat when it's 30 degrees outside, but with actual life or death consequences. But here's what makes November particularly cruel in your medieval world. It's the month of reckoning. All those decisions you made during harvest season, how much grain to sell versus store, whether to slaughter that extra pig or keep it through winter, how many bundles of firewood constitute enough, those choices now reveal themselves as either brilliant or catastrophic. There's no going back, no second chances, no running to the medieval equivalent of a grocery store when you realize you've miscalculated. You spend your days in a constant state of mental arithmetic. Every meal becomes a calculation. If you eat this much porridge today, will there be enough barley to last until March? Every log thrown on the fire represents a trade-off. Warmth now versus potential hypothermia later. It's like playing chess with death himself. And death has been practicing this game for centuries while you're still figuring out the rules. The social dynamics of your village change too. Neighbors who were friendly and generous during the abundance of autumn now eye each other with barely concealed suspicion. That smile your friend gives you might be genuine warmth, or it might be someone calculating whether your family has more stored grain than theirs. Medieval people weren't necessarily greedier than modern folks. They were just facing a reality where generosity could literally kill you. Historians still argue whether medieval communities became more cooperative or more competitive during winter months. But from where you're standing, It feels like a bit of both cooperative when you need to share labor for survival tasks, competitive when resources become scarce. Your daily routine shifts dramatically. The long, leisurely days of summer, when you could work the fields until sunset, are replaced by a frantic race against daylight. You wake in darkness, work in a brief window of gray light, and return to darkness again. It's like living in a world that's slowly forgetting how to be bright. The sun, when it bothers to appear at all, hangs low and weak in the sky, offering about as much warmth as a candle held at arm's length. The very concept of time becomes different in November. In summer, you measured your day by the sun's position and the tasks at hand. Now, you measure everything by survival priorities. Morning means checking that your animals survived the night. Midday means maximizing whatever weak warmth the sun provides. Evening means securing everything against another potentially deadly night. It's like living by a different calendar entirely, one written not in months and weeks, but in degrees of cold and hours of daylight. Water becomes a concern you never had to think about during summer. The well that bubbled cheerfully a month ago now requires real effort to draw from. Sometimes you lower your bucket and hear it scrape against ice. You learn to break thin layers of ice with a stick before drawing water. And you discover that medieval people had their own version of Murphy's Law. The day you most need water is the day the well decides to give you the least. Your clothing strategy changes too. Those light linen garments that felt so comfortable in summer now seem like cruel jokes. You begin the ritual of layering wool over linen, with whatever animal skins you can manage on top. You look like a walking textile warehouse, and you move with the graceful efficiency of a stuffed scarecrow. But vanity is a luxury you can't afford when hypothermia is a daily threat. Medieval fashion was practical by necessity, and winter fashion was survival gear disguised as clothing. The very air around you becomes an adversary. That November wind doesn't just blow, it searches. It finds every gap in your clothing, every crack in your cottage walls, every weakness in your defenses against the cold. Medieval builders were skilled, but they worked with materials that Mother Nature could easily exploit. Your daub and wattle walls, so sturdy and reliable in summer, now reveal tiny fissures that invite the cold inside like unwelcome guests who refuse to leave. Here's something modern people rarely consider. Medieval peasants were essentially amateur meteorologists by necessity. You learn to read the sky like a survival manual. That particular shade of gray means snow within hours. The way the wind shifts from south to north tells you a cold front is coming. The behavior of your animals becomes a weather forecast more reliable than any modern app. When your chickens refuse to leave their roost, you know to prepare for a harsh day. Animals sense the change too. Your chickens, usually scattered across the yard pecking and clucking, now huddle together in suspicious clusters. They've stopped laying eggs with the same regularity, another blow to your protein supply when you can least afford it. Your pig, assuming you haven't slaughtered it yet, moves with less enthusiasm, as if conserving energy for the ordeal ahead. Even your dog seems to understand that playtime is over. It's survival season now. Food preservation becomes an art form born of desperation. You've already stored your grain in whatever containers you could manage: clay pots, wooden barrels, woven baskets lined with pitch. But storage is only half the battle. Now you must ration, and rationing in medieval times wasn't about mild inconvenience. It was about calculating exactly how many spoonfuls of grain per day will keep you alive without running out before spring planting season. The psychological pressure is immense. Modern people complain about seasonal affective disorder, but they've never experienced true medieval winter depression, when your survival literally depends on the decisions you make each day. When one mistake could mean death for your entire family, the weight of responsibility becomes crushing. You go to sleep each night wondering if tomorrow will bring some catastrophe you haven't prepared for: a harsh freeze that kills your remaining vegetables, a leak in your grain storage that lets in moisture and rot, an injury that prevents you from gathering the firewood you desperately need. Sleep itself becomes different in November. You don't just lie down and drift off anymore. You perform a nightly ritual of survival preparation, banking the fire so coals will last until morning, checking that your animals are secure, listening for sounds that might indicate trouble, the crack of breaking wood that could mean your roof is failing under ice weight, the sound of animals in distress, the particular whistle of wind that warns of a serious storm approaching. Yet there's something almost meditative about this November preparation phase. The urgency creates a focus that modern life rarely demands. Every action has clear purpose and immediate consequences. When you're splitting wood, you're not just exercising, literally creating the warmth that will keep you alive. When you're checking your grain stores, you're not just organizing, ensuring your family's survival through the hungry months ahead. Your relationship with time itself changes. Summer days feel endless and forgiving. There's always tomorrow to finish what you didn't complete today. But November days are precious and unforgiving. Each hour of daylight must be used efficiently because darkness comes early and stays late. You become acutely aware of the sun's position, the wind's direction, the subtle signs that indicate whether tomorrow will be workable or weatherbound. The medieval concept of enough becomes starkly clear in November. Enough firewood means you won't freeze. Enough food means you won't starve. Enough shelter means you won't die of exposure. But enough is always a guess, always a gamble against an uncertain future. You can never really know if you have enough until winter is over and you're still alive to tell about it. Here's a historical tidbit that might surprise you. Medieval people actually had a term for the specific type of exhaustion that came with November preparation. They called it winter weariness, not the fatigue of hard work, but the bone-deep tiredness that comes from constant vigilance against mortality. It was recognized as a real condition, something that affected entire communities as they transitioned from the relative abundance of harvest season to the stark reality of winter survival. As November progresses toward December, you notice how your medieval world contracts. The horizon seems closer, the sky lower, the familiar landmarks somehow more distant. It's as if winter is slowly erasing the comfortable geography of your warmer weather life, replacing it with a smaller, harsher world where every resource is precious and every day brings new challenges to your ingenuity and endurance. The very concept of privacy changes too. In summer, you could step outside for solitude, walk to the fields for a moment of peace. Now, every venture outside must have purpose and be brief. Your world shrinks to the interior of your cottage, shared with family members, farm animals, and anyone else who contributes to collective survival. Personal space becomes as rare and precious as summer sunshine. The countdown has begun, and you're about to discover what winter truly means when survival depends entirely on your own preparation, skill, and a hefty dose of medieval luck. November is just the warning. The real test lies ahead in the months when the world turns truly hostile, when every day becomes a negotiation between comfort and survival, between warmth and fuel conservation, between hunger and hope. The first serious rain of late November arrives like a warning shot, and you quickly realize that medieval winter isn't just about cold, it's about mud. Not the charming, puddle-jumping mud of modern suburbia, but a thick, sucking, ankle-deep nightmare that transforms your entire world into what feels like a medieval swamp designed by someone with a particularly cruel sense of humor. You step outside your cottage on this gray morning, and your foot immediately sinks into what was solid ground just yesterday. The earth has become a treacherous mixture of water, decomposing leaves, animal waste, and clay that grabs at your crude leather shoes like it's personally offended by your attempt to walk anywhere. This is the beginning of what medieval people grimly called the mud season, a period that could last anywhere from a few weeks to several months, depending on how vindictive Mother Nature was feeling that particular year. Every step becomes a calculated risk. You learn to test the ground ahead with a stick, probing for solid footing like you're navigating a minefield. The paths between your cottage and essential destinations, the well, the animal shelter, the grain storage become obstacle courses that would challenge a modern parkour athlete. You develop a peculiar walking style, a kind of shuffling slide that minimizes the chances of losing your shoe to the hungry mud, though you still spend a frustrating amount of time fishing footwear out of particularly aggressive puddles. The mud doesn't just impede your movement, it actively seems to conspire against your survival efforts. That carefully stacked firewood you spent weeks preparing, half of it now sits in puddles, slowly absorbing moisture that will make it nearly impossible to burn efficiently. Your vegetable garden, where you hope to harvest a few late turnips and cabbages, has become a soggy mess where finding your crops requires archaeological-level excavation skills. It's like Mother Nature decided to play the world's most inconvenient practical joke right when you can least afford to find it amusing. But here's where medieval ingenuity really shines through desperation. You learn to read mud like a complex language. Different textures tell different stories. The thick, dark mud near the animal pen means good drainage underneath solid ground lurks maybe 6 inches down. The lighter, almost liquid mud near the stream means you're dealing with actual flooding, and no amount of careful stepping will help you there. The mud with chunks of straw and debris mixed in, that's where your neighbors have been dumping their waste, and you definitely don't want to investigate that area too closely. Your animals suffer through mud season with the same grim determination you do, but they're arguably better equipped for it. Pigs, naturally, think this is the best thing that's happened since slop was invented. They roll and wallow in the mud with obvious joy, completely oblivious to your growing frustration with the mess they're creating. You watch them and can't help but feel a twinge of envy. Imagine being so perfectly adapted to miserable conditions that you actually enjoy them. Chickens, on the other hand, approach mud with the disdain of aristocrats forced to walk through a peasant market. They pick their way delicately through the muck, occasionally stopping to glare at you as if this is somehow your fault. Their egg production drops dramatically during mud season, partly because they're stressed and partly because finding their eggs in the muddy chaos of their coop becomes like hunting for buried treasure without a map. Your horse, if you're fortunate enough to own one, becomes a different kind of challenge during mud season. Horses can navigate mud, but they're not particularly happy about it, and an unhappy medieval horse is a dangerous thing. You learn to check their hooves obsessively, picking out packed mud and debris that could cause lameness. A lame horse in medieval winter isn't just an inconvenience. It's a potential death sentence for a family that depends on that animal for transportation and heavy labor. The psychological impact of mud season hits harder than you might expect. There's something deeply demoralizing about having every simple task become exponentially more difficult. Fetching water from the well, normally a 5-minute chore, now requires 20 minutes of careful navigation, plus additional time to clean the mud off yourself, your bucket, and anything else that got splattered in the process. It's like living in a world where gravity has suddenly doubled. Everything requires more effort, more time, more energy you can't afford to waste. Medieval record-keeping, sparse as it was, occasionally mentions the specific challenges of mud season. One particularly descriptive account from a 13th century monastery describes monks having to carry each other piggyback style to avoid losing their sandals in what the chronicler dramatically called the devil's own porridge. Another document from a manor house describes servants using wooden planks to create makeshift bridges across the courtyard that was apparently so muddy that horses were getting stuck and had to be pulled out with ropes. Historians still argue whether these accounts were literal descriptions or medieval hyperbole, but anyone who's experienced serious mud season knows they were probably both. Your clothing strategy requires complete reconsideration during this period. Those woolen garments that provided such reliable warmth in dry cold weather now become a liability. Wet wool is not just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. It loses its insulating properties while becoming impossibly heavy, and it takes forever to dry in the damp conditions that characterize mud season. You learn to prioritize keeping at least one set of completely dry clothes, even if it means wearing damp, uncomfortable garments during the day. The social dynamics of your village change dramatically during mud season. Visiting neighbors becomes a major expedition rather than a casual social call. Community gatherings, so important for maintaining morale during the dark months, become nearly impossible when traveling 100 yards requires the planning and equipment of a military campaign. You begin to understand why medieval villages were built so compactly during mud season. Distance becomes exponentially more challenging. Church attendance, theoretically mandatory for medieval peasants, becomes a genuine test of faith when getting to Sunday services requires risking life and limb in treacherous mud. Priests, being practical men despite their spiritual calling, often shorten services during the worst of mud season, understanding that congregation members were burning precious energy just reaching the church building. Food preparation takes on new complications when everything in your environment is constantly damp or dirty. Keeping your grain dry becomes an obsession that borders on paranoia. You check your storage containers multiple times per day, looking for signs of moisture infiltration that could ruin your entire winter supply in a matter of days. The clay pots that seemed so reliable in dry weather now reveal hairline cracks that invite disaster. Cooking becomes its own adventure during mud season. The vegetables you manage to excavate from your garden come with enough soil attached to plant a new garden. You spend almost as much time washing food as cooking it, and in a world where clean water isn't guaranteed, this creates yet another layer of complexity in your survival calculations. Here's something modern people rarely consider. Medieval peasants became expert at improvised engineering during mud season. You learn to build temporary walkways using whatever materials you can scavenge: flat stones, discarded pieces of wood, bundles of straw tied together. These pathways require constant maintenance as the mud shifts and settles, but they represent the difference between functional survival and being trapped in your cottage until the ground freezes solid. The creation of these temporary structures becomes a community effort. Neighbors pool resources to create passable routes between essential locations. Someone contributes stones. Another provides rope or twine to hold bundles together. A third offers labor for the actual construction. It's medieval infrastructure development on the smallest possible scale, but it works. The mud also affects your relationship with fire and heat management. Wet clothing and muddy shoes can't just be hung near the fire to dry. That creates dangerous steam and smoke that could suffocate you in your small, poorly ventilated cottage. You develop elaborate systems for drying gear without wasting precious fuel or creating hazardous conditions. Everything becomes a balancing act between staying warm, staying dry, and conserving resources. Water quality becomes a serious concern during mud season. Wells that provided clean water during dry periods now yield liquid that looks suspiciously like the mud you've been walking through all day. You learn primitive filtration techniques using cloth, sand, and charcoal, though the results are often questionable at best. Boiling water becomes essential, but that requires fuel you're trying to conserve, creating yet another survival calculation in your daily medieval math. The economic implications of mud season hit your medieval community hard. Trade slows to a crawl when merchants can't reliably transport goods along muddy roads. Markets become sporadic or disappear entirely for weeks at a time. This isolation means that whatever resources your community has on hand are all you can count on until conditions improve. There's no sending to the next village for supplies you forgot to stockpile. Your sleep patterns change too during mud season. The sound of rain on your thatched roof, which might have been soothing during summer evenings, now becomes a source of anxiety. Each drop represents more mud tomorrow, more difficulty reaching essential resources, more complications in an already complicated survival situation. You lie awake listening for the particular sounds that indicate your roof is failing, the shift from rhythmic pattering to irregular dripping that suggests water is finding its way through your ceiling. The mud creates unexpected dangers that you never had to consider during dry weather. Sinkholes form overnight in areas that seemed solid for months. Streams change course, creating new hazards where safe paths used to exist. Trees undermined by saturated soil fall without warning, blocking routes and creating obstacles that would challenge a medieval engineer to overcome. Medieval children experience mud season differently than adults, but not necessarily better. While they might initially find the muddy conditions entertaining, they quickly learn that playtime has been suspended indefinitely. Children who wander off the established safe paths can easily become lost or stuck, creating dangerous search and rescue situations for adults who can't afford to waste time or energy on avoidable emergencies. But here's where medieval community spirit really shows itself. Mud season brings out both the worst and best in people. Neighbors who might normally keep to themselves during easier times now understand that mutual assistance isn't just neighborly, it's essential for survival. You develop informal networks for sharing information about passable routes, safe water sources, and effective techniques for dealing with mud-related challenges. Your domestic animals require entirely different care strategies during mud season. Chickens need elevated, dry spaces or they'll literally drown in the mud, not dramatically, but through gradual exposure and inability to stay warm and dry. You become an expert at improvised animal housing, using whatever materials you can gather to keep your livestock alive and productive during conditions that seem designed to kill everything that moves. The constant dampness affects more than just mobility and comfort. It creates perfect conditions for diseases and infections that could prove fatal in your medieval world without antibiotics or modern medical care. You notice minor cuts and scrapes taking longer to heal, developing angry red edges that suggest infection. Respiratory ailments become more common as everyone spends time in damp clothing and poorly ventilated spaces. Tool maintenance becomes critically important during mud season. Your essential implements, shovels, buckets, knives, anything made of metal require constant cleaning and care to prevent rust and deterioration in the constant damp conditions. You learn to oil metal tools with whatever animal fat you can spare, creating yet another drain on your carefully hoarded resources. The mud affects even your most basic personal hygiene routines. In summer, you could wash clothes in the stream and expect them to dry reasonably quickly. Now, wet clothing stays wet for days or weeks, and the stream itself may be too muddy for washing anyway. You develop a tolerance for dirt and odors that would horrify modern sensibilities. But cleanliness becomes a luxury you simply can't afford when survival is the priority. Navigation becomes an art form during mud season. Familiar landmarks disappear underwater or become inaccessible due to muddy conditions. You learn to create mental maps based on what remains passable, constantly updating your routes as conditions change. Getting lost during mud season isn't just inconvenient, it can be fatal if you can't find your way back before dark or before exhaustion overtakes you. As mud season progresses, you begin to develop a kind of grudging respect for this particular form of natural adversity. It's not as immediately threatening as a blizzard or as obviously dangerous as extreme cold, but it's relentlessly persistent in making every aspect of survival more difficult. Like a bureaucratic nightmare designed by nature itself, mud season doesn't kill you quickly, it just makes staying alive exponentially harder until you begin to wonder if you have the energy and resources to outlast it. The transition from mud season to frozen ground actually becomes something to anticipate eagerly, despite the obvious downsides of harder cold. At least frozen mud is predictable and navigable. You can walk on it without sinking, plan routes without wondering if the path will exist when you need it, and focus your survival efforts on staying warm rather than staying mobile. When that first hard freeze finally arrives, transforming the treacherous mud into solid, if bumpy, ground, you feel a relief that's almost spiritual in its intensity. The first hard freeze arrives in December, transforming yesterday's treacherous mud into solid, navigable ground, but this relief brings with it a new and consuming obsession: firewood. You wake each morning to the sight of your breath fogging inside your cottage, and the pile of carefully split logs that seemed so substantial in autumn now looks disturbingly small against the backdrop of winter's long, cold months ahead. Firewood becomes the currency of survival in your medieval world. Every stick, every log, every bundle of kindling represents hours of potential warmth, and you begin to understand why medieval people developed such an intimate relationship with trees. Oak burns hot and long but takes forever to split. Birch catches easily but burns fast. Pine lights quickly but creates dangerous creosote buildup in your primitive chimney. You become a connoisseur of combustible materials, able to judge the heat value of a piece of wood just by its weight, grain, and the sound it makes when you knock two pieces together. Your daily routine now revolves entirely around the mathematics of fire. How many logs will you burn tonight to stay alive? How many can you afford to burn and still have enough for tomorrow? How much heat can you generate while cooking your meager breakfast? And can you time your cooking to maximize the warming benefit throughout the day? It's like playing a complex strategy game where losing means freezing to death. The search for fuel becomes a constant background activity that colors every decision you make. When you venture outside for any reason, you're always scanning for fallen branches, looking for dead trees that might be safe to harvest, calculating whether that tempting pile of wood near your neighbor's cottage is truly abandoned, or if taking it might create a deadly enemy relationship. Medieval communities had complex, often unwritten rules about wood gathering rights, and violating these could result in anything from social ostracism to actual violence. You learn to see your environment through the lens of combustibility. That broken fence post isn't just Debrizit's 3 days' worth of kindling if you can split it properly. The straw from your animal's bedding isn't just wasteite's essential fire-starting material that can mean the difference between a roaring fire and a cold, dark night. Even animal dung becomes precious when dried properly. It burns slowly and steadily, though with an aroma that takes some getting used to. It's amazing how quickly your standards for pleasant household scents adapt when survival is on the line. The art of fire management becomes as complex as running a medieval laboratory. You learn to bank fires for overnight burning, covering coals with ash to slow their consumption while keeping them alive until morning. You master the delicate balance of airflow that keeps a fire burning efficiently without wasting fuel. You develop techniques for extracting maximum heat from minimum wood, understanding instinctively how to position logs for optimal burning patterns. Here's something that would surprise modern people. Medieval peasants were incredibly sophisticated in their understanding of thermal dynamics, even without any formal scientific training. You learn to create thermal masses using stones heated by the fire, then wrapped in cloth and placed in beds or against bodies for long-lasting warmth. You understand how to use your own body heat most efficiently, wearing layers in specific combinations that trap warm air while allowing moisture to escape. But the psychological pressure of fuel conservation creates a constant state of low-level anxiety that affects every aspect of your daily life. You find yourself standing next to a perfectly adequate fire, feeling reasonably warm, but hesitating to add another log because you're not sure you truly need it yet. This internal debate between immediate comfort and long-term survival becomes a recurring theme that plays out dozens of times each day. The social implications of firewood scarcity become apparent as winter deepens. Families with inadequate fuel supplies begin making increasingly desperate decisions. Some sell precious food stores to buy wood from better-prepared neighbors. Others begin burning furniture, roof beams, or other structural elements of their home's decisions that provide short-term relief but create long-term catastrophes. Historians still argue whether medieval communities became more sharing or more hoarding during severe fuel shortages. But the evidence suggests both behaviors occurred simultaneously, often within the same households. Your relationship with trees becomes almost spiritual during this period. You develop preferences for specific groves, understanding which stands of timber are likely to provide the best fuel with the least effort. You learn to read the signs of diseased or dying trees that will be easier to harvest, and you become an expert at judging whether a standing dead tree will fall safely or if attempting to cut it down might kill you in the process. The tools required for effective firewood gathering and processing become precious beyond their practical value. A sharp axe isn't just useful, it's the difference between efficiently processing fuel and exhausting yourself with ineffective chopping that wastes both energy and time you can't afford to lose. You spend significant time maintaining your cutting tools, sharpening blades with whatever whetstones you can find, protecting metal surfaces from rust with precious animal fats. Medieval people developed some remarkably creative solutions for maximizing fuel efficiency. You learn to build reflector walls behind your fire using stones or mud-daubed sticks, directing more heat into your living space rather than losing it up the chimney. You master the art of cooking multiple items simultaneously, using different areas of the fire for different cooking needs, extracting maximum utility from every piece of burning wood. The timing of fuel collection becomes critically important as winter progresses. You can't wait for convenient moments to gather wood. You must venture out whenever conditions permit, regardless of other needs or preferences. A sunny day with little wind becomes an opportunity that can't be wasted, even if you're feeling ill or have other pressing tasks. The wood won't collect itself, and tomorrow's weather might make gathering impossible. Here's a fascinating historical detail. Medieval communities often had designated fuel wardens, whose job was to monitor and regulate wood gathering to prevent overharvesting that could leave everyone without adequate supplies. These positions were taken seriously because poor fuel management could doom an entire village. The wardens had authority to restrict gathering during critical periods and to organize community woodcutting expeditions when weather permitted. Your sleep becomes influenced by fire management considerations. You wake periodically throughout the night to check on your banked coals, adding small amounts of fuel to keep the fire alive without creating dangerous flare-ups. This fragmented sleep pattern becomes normal, even necessary, because letting a fire die completely means spending precious time and materials rebuilding it from scratch, assuming you have adequate fire-starting materials available. The search for alternative fuel sources pushes you toward creative solutions that would seem bizarre to modern people. Dried grass bundled tightly burns quickly but provides intense heat for cooking. Corn cobs, if you're fortunate enough to have them, burn surprisingly well and leave minimal ash. Even thick paper or parchment, though incredibly precious in medieval times, might be sacrificed to fire during desperate moments. Children play different roles in fuel gathering depending on their age and ability. Young children can gather small kindling and help with fire-tending tasks that don't require heavy lifting or dangerous tool use. Older children become essential partners in wood processing, learning skills that they'll need for their own survival as adults. The entire family becomes a fuel-gathering unit, with each member contributing according to their capabilities. Weather prediction becomes crucial for planning fuel-gathering expeditions. You learn to read cloud formations, wind patterns, and animal behavior to predict when you'll have safe opportunities to venture out for wood collection. A storm that traps you indoors for several days can be catastrophic if it catches you with inadequate fuel supplies, so you develop almost supernatural sensitivity to approaching weather changes. The sound of wood burning becomes a constant soundtrack to your winter life, but different sounds convey different information. The cheerful crackling of dry hardwood burning efficiently. The angry hissing of wet wood that's wasting heat on evaporation rather than providing warmth. The dangerous roaring of a fire that's burning too hot and might ignite your roof or chimney. You become fluent in the language of combustion. Storage and organization of firewood becomes an art form that would impress modern efficiency experts. You sort wood by size, dryness, and burn characteristics, keeping the best pieces for the coldest nights and saving fast-burning kindling for cooking tasks. You rotate your stock, using older pieces first while seasoning newer acquisitions. Every piece of wood has its place and purpose in your survival strategy. The economics of firewood create interesting social dynamics within your medieval community. Wealthy families might hire others to gather and process their fuel, creating temporary employment for those desperate enough to trade labor for food or other necessities. Poor families might pool resources for shared woodcutting expeditions, combining tools and effort to make fuel gathering more efficient for everyone involved. Your relationship with different types of wood becomes incredibly nuanced. Hardwoods like oak and hickory are the gold standard. They burn hot, long, and clean, providing maximum heat per log. But they're also the most difficult to split and the most coveted by everyone in your community. Softwoods like pine and fir are easier to process but burn quickly and can create dangerous creosote buildup that might ignite your chimney. Fruitwoods like apple and cherry, if you can find them, provide excellent heat and pleasant aroma, but they're often too valuable as food sources to justify burning except in the most desperate circumstances. Birch bark becomes precious as fire-starting material because it ignites easily even when damp, making it invaluable during wet weather when getting a fire started can mean the difference between life and death. The science of fire starting in medieval conditions requires skills that most modern people have never needed to develop. You become an expert at creating tinder from various materials: dried fungus, birds' nests, fine wood shavings, even your own hair in desperate situations. You learn to maintain a constant supply of dry kindling in graduated sizes, from pencil-thin twigs to thumb-thick branches, understanding that successful fire building depends on a careful progression from smallest to largest fuel. Your fire-starting tools become precious survival equipment. Flint and steel, if you're fortunate enough to own them, require careful maintenance and protection from moisture. Char cloth fabric partially burned in controlled conditions to create easily ignitable material becomes as valuable as food. You learn to recognize and collect natural tinders like birch bark, dry moss, and fibrous materials that can catch and hold a spark long enough to build into flame. The psychology of fuel anxiety affects your decision-making in ways that extend far beyond fire management. You find yourself hoarding any combustible material, unable to throw away even small scraps of wood or paper that might someday contribute to your survival. This medieval version of resource anxiety becomes a defining characteristic of winter life, influencing everything from social relationships to daily routines. Fire safety becomes a constant concern when your survival depends on maintaining flames in structures built largely from flammable materials. You develop elaborate systems for containing fires, using stones to create safe boundaries and understanding how to manage drafts that could spread flames beyond your hearth. Water for fire suppression becomes another precious resource that must be kept unfrozen and accessible. The heating efficiency of your medieval cottage becomes a subject of obsessive attention. You learn to identify and seal air leaks using mud, rags, or whatever materials you can find. You understand how to position yourself and your family to maximize the benefit of radiant heat from your fire. You develop strategies for heating specific areas of your living space rather than trying to warm the entire structure, an impossible task with limited fuel. Tool improvisation becomes essential when your specialized equipment fails or proves inadequate. You learn to split wood using wedges made from hardwood when metal tools aren't available. You discover how to create effective kindling using knives, rocks, or even your fingernails when proper tools break or become dull. Every piece of metal becomes a potential fire management tool. The social etiquette around fire and fuel becomes complex during winter months. Visiting neighbors means bringing your own fuel contribution rather than expecting to share their precious resources. Offering to share fire-starting materials becomes a gesture of significant friendship. Borrowing fuel creates serious obligations that must be repaid when conditions permit. Time management revolves around fuel availability and weather conditions. You plan your most fuel-intensive activities: cooking, heating wash water, major warming sessions for times when you can afford the expense. You learn to coordinate multiple tasks around single fires, maximizing the utility of each piece of burned wood. As winter deepens and your carefully hoarded wood supply dwindles despite your best conservation efforts, you begin to understand the true meaning of medieval resource anxiety. Every log burned brings you closer to the point where you'll need to make increasingly desperate choices about heat versus survival. The pile that seemed adequate in November looks frighteningly small in January, and you begin to comprehend why medieval people viewed winter survival as a victory rather than an expectation. The relationship between firewood and food becomes complicated during the deepest winter months. Cooking requires fuel, but staying warm also requires fuel, and you often face decisions about whether to cook food thoroughly or to conserve wood by eating cold meals. Raw or undercooked food presents its own survival risks, but so does burning through your fuel supply too quickly. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from ancient times? Well, medieval people had their own questionable fuel solutions, including burning dried animal dung mixed with straw when wood became scarce. It wasn't pleasant, but it was better than freezing, and survival often requires accepting less than ideal solutions when ideal ones aren't available. The daily grind of fuel management becomes a meditation on mortality and preparation. Each piece of wood burned represents time you spent gathering, processing, and storing fuel, and time that fuel will provide warmth and life. Understanding this relationship between effort and survival creates a deep appreciation for resources that modern abundance has largely eliminated from contemporary experience. By January, the reality of medieval winter hunger sets in with a clarity that cuts deeper than the cold itself. Your carefully rationed grain stores, which seemed so substantial during harvest season, now reveal themselves as woefully inadequate against the relentless appetite of survival. You wake each morning to a gnawing emptiness that has become your constant companion, and you begin to understand why medieval people called this time the starving months. The mathematics of medieval hunger are brutally simple. You need a certain number of calories each day to maintain body heat and basic function, but you have a finite amount of food that must last until spring crops become available. Every meal becomes an exercise in desperate calculation. That handful of barley that would make a satisfying bowl of porridge must instead be stretched into thin gruel that provides just enough nutrition to keep you alive but leaves you perpetually, achingly hungry. You learn to measure food not in satisfying portions but in survival increments. A single grain of barley becomes significant. A small piece of preserved meat gets divided into portions so tiny that eating becomes more about the psychological comfort of chewing than any actual nutritional satisfaction. Your stomach shrinks and adapts, but your hunger never disappears. It just becomes a background condition of existence, like the cold or the darkness. The hierarchy of food desperation follows a predictable pattern in your medieval world. First, you consume the foods you actually enjoy, the better grains. Any remaining fresh vegetables, the choicer preserved meats. Then you move to the foods you can tolerate, coarser grains, root vegetables that have started to soften, meat that's beginning to taste questionable. Finally, you reach the foods you never wanted to eat but that will keep you alive, moldy grain carefully cleaned, vegetables that are more rot than nutrition, and substances that can barely be called food at all. Your cooking strategies evolve to extract maximum nutritional value from minimum ingredients. You learn to make broths from bones you've already boiled multiple times, somehow coaxing a few more calories from marrow and cartilage that seemed completely depleted. You discover that grain husks, normally fed to animals, can be ground and mixed with flour to extend your bread supply, though the resulting food has the texture and appeal of chewing sawdust. It's like trying to make a gourmet meal from what modern people would consider garbage, except failure means death rather than just disappointment. Medieval people developed remarkably creative techniques for finding calories during the hungry months. You learn to identify edible bark from certain trees. Birch, willow, and poplar can be processed into a flour substitute that provides some nutrition, though it takes enormous effort to gather and process enough to make a meaningful difference. Pine needles can be brewed into a tea that provides essential vitamins, though it tastes like drinking Christmas tree trimmings. The social dynamics of hunger create tensions that can destroy community relationships built over generations. When your neighbor's child is clearly better fed than yours, the sight generates a resentment that's difficult to suppress even when you understand that everyone is struggling. Food sharing, which seemed natural during times of abundance, becomes complicated when every shared morsel represents potential starvation for your own family. Here's a historical detail that illustrates medieval desperation. Monastery records from harsh winters describe monks grinding acorns, beechnuts, and even dried peas that had been stored for planting into flour substitutes. These weren't gourmet food experiments, they were survival measures undertaken by people who understood agriculture and nutrition better than most of their contemporaries. One particularly detailed account from a German monastery describes brothers spending entire days processing acorns to remove the bitter tannins that make them nearly inedible, then grinding the remaining nuts into a coarse flour that could extend their bread supplies for precious additional weeks. Historians still argue whether these emergency food sources provided adequate nutrition or merely delayed starvation, but the records suggest they kept people alive long enough to reach spring. Some scholars believe that medieval people had more sophisticated understanding of wild food sources than previously thought, while others argue that desperation drove people to consume anything remotely edible regardless of nutritional value. Your relationship with hunting and foraging changes dramatically during the hungry months. Animals that seemed merely inconvenient during abundant times, rats, crows, anything that moves and contains protein, become potential meals worth the effort required to catch them. You learn to set snares and traps using whatever materials you can spare. Though success is rare and the energy expended hunting often exceeds the calories gained from your catch, the art of medieval foraging becomes incredibly sophisticated during winter months. You develop an encyclopedic knowledge of your local environment that would impress modern naturalists. You learn that cattail roots, buried in frozen marshlands, can be dug up and processed into starchy flour. You discover that certain mushrooms continue growing even in winter conditions, though distinguishing edible varieties from poisonous ones becomes a life-or-death skill that many people get wrong. Wild rose hips, if you can find them preserved under snow, provide essential vitamins that can prevent scurvy, disease that kills more medieval people during winter than starvation itself. But finding these tiny fruits requires knowing exactly where rose bushes grew during summer, then spending hours digging through snow and ice to locate shriveled berries that might contain enough nutrition to make the search worthwhile. The psychological effects of sustained hunger go beyond simple discomfort. Your ability to concentrate diminishes, making complex tasks more difficult and dangerous. Your emotional regulation becomes unpredictable. You might find yourself crying over spilled grain or becoming irrationally angry about minor inconveniences. Sleep becomes fitful and filled with dreams about food, and you wake feeling less rested despite spending more time in bed to conserve energy. Medieval children suffer differently during hungry months, but their suffering is often more visible and heartbreaking. Their growth slows or stops entirely, and their usual energy and curiosity fade into listless acceptance of constant hunger. Parents face impossible decisions about food allocation. Feeding children adequately might mean adults become too weak to perform essential survival tasks, but allowing children to go hungry violates every parental instinct. Children's games change during the hungry months, becoming focused on imaginary feasts and elaborate fantasies about abundant food. They create play scenarios around cooking and eating that reveal how deeply food scarcity affects their developing minds. Some children become obsessed with saving tiny crumbs or hiding insignificant food scraps, developing hoarding behaviors that will persist long after the hunger ends. Food preservation techniques that seemed optional during harvest become critically important as you watch your supplies dwindle. You learn to extend the life of questionable food by carefully removing mold, cutting away rotten portions, and treating anything edible as precious beyond measure. That piece of bread that's hard enough to break teeth becomes a delicacy when soaked in warm water until it's soft enough to chew. The economics of medieval hunger create desperate markets where normal values become inverted. A handful of grain might be worth more than silver jewelry. Fresh eggs, if you can find them, become literally priceless because no amount of money can create chickens that lay during the deepest winter months. People trade family heirlooms, tools essential for spring planting, even warm clothing for immediate food needs. Your digestive system adapts to the realities of hunger in ways that would fascinate and horrify modern nutritionists. You learn to eat foods that would normally cause illness: slightly spoiled meat, grain contaminated with ergot, vegetables that have partially decomposed. Your stomach develops a tolerance for substances that would sicken well-fed people, though the long-term health consequences are severe and often permanent. The timing of meals becomes strategic rather than convenient. You learn to eat your largest portion when you need energy for essential tasks, even if that means going to bed hungry. You discover that drinking warm water can temporarily ease the pain of an empty stomach, though it provides no nutrition. You understand how to space small amounts of food throughout the day to maintain blood sugar levels rather than eating everything at once and suffering energy crashes. Medieval people developed some surprisingly sophisticated techniques for dealing with food scarcity. One method involved creating hunger bread by mixing whatever grain was available with ground roots, bark, and even clay to create bulk that would fill stomachs even if it provided minimal nutrition. Another technique involved fermenting vegetable scraps to create acidic broths that could help preserve other foods while providing some vitamins. The process of making hunger bread becomes an art form during desperate times. You learn to grind tree bark into powder fine enough to mix with precious grain flour, creating loaves that are technically bread but bear little resemblance to normal food. The mixture might include ground acorns, dried and powdered vegetables, even small amounts of clay that some medieval people believed helped with digestion and provided essential minerals. The relationship between hunger and cold becomes a vicious cycle that defines medieval winter survival. Inadequate food means your body can't generate sufficient heat, making you more vulnerable to cold exposure. But staying warm requires burning precious fuel that you might not be able to replace. And gathering fuel requires energy you don't have because you're not eating enough. It's like being trapped in a downward spiral where every survival strategy conflicts with every other survival need. Food-related injuries become more common during hungry months, not because people become careless, but because hunger affects judgment and physical coordination. You might take risks while foraging that you would normally avoid, or attempt to process questionable food in ways that could cause illness or injury. Desperation makes people attempt dangerous food acquisition strategies, climbing unstable trees for nuts, venturing onto thin ice for fish, eating substances they know might be harmful. Your sense of taste changes during prolonged hunger. Foods that would normally taste bland or unpleasant become intensely flavorful and satisfying. A simple broth made from vegetable scraps tastes like a feast when you haven't had adequate nutrition for weeks. Your appreciation for basic sustenance becomes almost spiritual. Eating becomes a profound experience rather than a casual necessity. The storage and protection of remaining food supplies becomes an obsession that affects every aspect of daily life. You check your grain containers multiple times each day, not just for moisture or pests, but to reassure yourself that your survival supplies still exist. You develop elaborate hiding places for small amounts of emergency food, understanding that even family members might make desperate decisions if they knew about hidden reserves. Water management becomes critically important during hunger periods because dehydration compounds the effects of malnutrition. But water sources may be frozen, contaminated, or require precious fuel to heat for drinking. You learn to melt snow efficiently, understanding that eating snow directly will lower your body temperature and waste energy you can't afford to lose. Medieval people understood that different foods provided different types of nutrition, even without modern scientific knowledge about vitamins and minerals. They knew that certain foods prevented specific illnesses. That variety was important even in small quantities, and that some foods provided more sustaining energy than others. This folk knowledge often made the difference between surviving winter and succumbing to malnutrition-related diseases. The social rituals around food change completely during hungry months. Sharing even small amounts becomes a gesture of profound friendship or familial love. Refusing to share food, even when you have barely enough for yourself, can destroy relationships permanently. Hospitality traditions that normally required offering food to visitors become impossible to maintain, creating social awkwardness and altered community dynamics. You develop strategies for managing the psychological aspects of hunger that go beyond simple food conservation. Keeping busy helps distract from the constant emptiness, though finding meaningful tasks when you lack energy becomes challenging. Some medieval people developed meditation-like practices around gratitude for whatever small amounts of food they had, understanding that mental attitude could affect their ability to survive physical hardship. The preparation and consumption of meals becomes ritualized during hungry times in ways that maximize both nutrition and psychological satisfaction. You learn to eat slowly, chewing thoroughly to extract maximum flavor and nutrients from minimal food. You understand how to present meager portions in ways that seem more substantial, using smaller bowls and careful arrangement to create the illusion of abundance. Medieval communities developed elaborate systems for sharing knowledge about emergency food sources. Older residents who had survived previous harsh winters became invaluable resources for information about wild foods, preservation techniques, and strategies for extending limited supplies. This knowledge transfer often meant the difference between community survival and catastrophic loss of life. The relationship between hunger and disease becomes apparent as winter progresses. Malnutrition weakens immune systems, making people more susceptible to infections and illnesses that might be minor inconveniences during well-fed times. A simple cold can become life-threatening when your body lacks the resources to fight infection while maintaining basic survival functions. As the hungry months progress from January into February, you begin to understand why medieval people viewed winter survival as a test of character as much as preparation. The constant hunger, combined with cold and darkness, creates a physical and psychological ordeal that challenges every assumption about human endurance. Yet somehow, people found ways to survive these conditions year after year, developing resilience and appreciation for abundance that modern comfort has largely eliminated from human experience. The knowledge that spring will eventually bring relief becomes both a comfort and a torment. You count days until potential green shoots might appear, until hunting might become viable again, until the desperate mathematics of calorie conservation might finally end. But spring feels impossibly distant when you're facing another day of hunger with dwindling supplies and no certainty that your calculations will prove adequate for survival. Remember that mud season we struggled through earlier? Well, the food scarcity makes every previous challenge seem manageable by comparison. At least during mud season, you had adequate nutrition to fuel your efforts to navigate difficult conditions. Now, every task requires energy you don't have, creating a survival puzzle that becomes more complex with each passing day. As the depth of winter sets in and resources dwindle, the concept of personal space becomes as extinct as summer warmth. You find yourself living in conditions that would horrify modern people but represent the difference between life and death in your medieval world, sharing not just your living space, but your body heat with every creature that can contribute to collective survival. Your tiny cottage, which seemed cramped enough during autumn, now houses an improbable collection of humans and animals all pressed together in what becomes known as the shared warmth strategy. Your family members sleep in a communal pile that would seem intimate beyond belief to contemporary standards, but when the alternative is freezing to death, privacy becomes a luxury nobody can afford. The animals join this survival huddle with surprising cooperation. Your pig, normally kept outside, now shares floor space with your family, contributing significant body heat while benefiting from the warmth generated by human bodies. Chickens roost inside your cottage, their small bodies adding to the collective heat while their presence ensures that any eggs they manage to produce won't freeze before you can collect them. Even your dog, cat, and whatever other creatures you've managed to keep alive become essential partners in this thermal alliance. This isn't just about cramming warm bodies together, it's about understanding medieval thermal dynamics in ways that would impress modern engineers. You learn that larger mammals generate more heat per body mass, making your pig an invaluable heating unit that also happens to provide potential food security. Smaller animals like chickens produce less heat individually, but can be positioned strategically to fill gaps in your human heat distribution network. The logistics of shared sleeping become incredibly complex. You develop systems for arranging bodies to maximize heat transfer while minimizing discomfort. Children, who lose heat more quickly than adults, get positioned in the center of the human pile. Adults arrange themselves to create windbreaks and heat retention barriers. Animals are positioned to provide warmth without creating sanitation disasters or safety hazards. Privacy, as modern people understand it, simply ceases to exist during the deepest winter months. Every bodily function becomes a shared experience because leaving the warmth zone for any extended period could result in dangerous heat loss. You develop elaborate social protocols for managing intimate human needs while maintaining the dignity necessary for community survival. Medieval people created ingenious solutions for managing the sanitation challenges that come with cramped living conditions. Chamber pots become essential equipment that must be managed carefully to avoid contaminating your limited living space. You learn to time waste elimination activities for moments when outdoor temperatures are briefly tolerable, though often this means choosing between staying warm and maintaining hygiene standards. The psychological adaptation to shared warmth requires abandoning modern concepts of personal boundaries. You learn to sleep pressed against family members, neighbors, and animals in ways that would seem inappropriate during normal times but become essential survival behaviors. Children adapt to these conditions more easily than adults, but everyone eventually accepts physical intimacy as a necessary survival strategy. Here's a historical detail that illustrates medieval practicality. Manor house records from harsh winters describe entire households, including servants, family members, and sometimes even valuable livestock sleeping in single rooms where shared body heat could be maximized. One particularly detailed account from a Scottish castle describes the Great Hall being converted into a communal sleeping area where dozens of people and animals shared warmth during a particularly brutal winter that lasted 5 months. The social dynamics of shared warmth create both cooperation and tension within your medieval community. Families might combine households temporarily, sharing resources and heat while navigating the complex interpersonal relationships that develop when people have no personal space. Arguments that would normally be resolved by physical separation must instead be worked out through negotiation and compromise, because leaving the warmth zone isn't a viable option. Your daily routines become choreographed around maintaining the shared warmth system. Morning activities must be coordinated so that essential tasks get completed without everyone leaving the warm zone simultaneously. Someone must tend the fire. Someone must check on food supplies. Someone must care for animals, but these activities must be staggered to ensure that the communal heat source isn't completely disrupted. The clothing strategies for shared warmth become sophisticated beyond what most people imagine medieval peasants could achieve. You learn to layer garments in ways that trap air and allow body heat to circulate between family members. Blankets, furs, and whatever fabric you can gather become communal resources shared among everyone in your survival group. Children require special consideration in the shared warmth strategy. Their smaller bodies lose heat more quickly, but they also generate less heat than adults. You develop techniques for keeping children warm that involve positioning them strategically within the human pile, wrapping them in additional layers, and ensuring they get adequate nutrition to fuel their internal heat generation. Medieval people understood that shared warmth wasn't just about physical contact, it involved understanding air circulation, moisture management, and the physics of heat transfer in ways that modern people rarely need to consider. You learn to create microclimates within your cottage, using hanging fabric to direct warm air and block cold drafts, understanding how to position bodies to create the most efficient heat exchange. The management of moisture becomes critically important in shared warmth situations. Human breath, body heat, and animal presence create humidity that can make your living space dangerously damp if not properly managed. You learn to balance ventilation needs against heat retention requirements, understanding that too much moisture can create conditions for disease and hypothermia. Cooking becomes a communal activity that serves multiple purposes beyond food preparation. The heat generated by cooking fires provides essential warmth. The activity of food preparation keeps people moving and generating body heat. And shared meals become important social rituals that maintain morale during the darkest months. You time cooking activities to provide maximum warming benefit when the cold is most dangerous. The relationship between humans and animals in shared warmth situations becomes surprisingly sophisticated. You learn to read animal behavior for signs that they're too hot, too cold, or becoming stressed by the unusual living arrangements. Animals that become agitated or sick can disrupt the entire shared warmth system, so maintaining animal health becomes essential for human survival. Historians still argue whether medieval shared warmth strategies were primarily practical necessities, or whether they also served important social functions in maintaining community cohesion during harsh winters. The evidence suggests both factors were important. Physical survival required shared resources and warmth, but the enforced intimacy also created bonds that helped communities survive the psychological challenges of winter isolation. The sleeping arrangements in shared warmth situations require careful planning to ensure everyone gets adequate rest despite the cramped conditions. You learn to coordinate sleep schedules so that someone is always awake to tend the fire and monitor for dangers, while ensuring that everyone gets enough rest to maintain the energy needed for survival tasks. Personal hygiene becomes a community challenge that requires creative solutions. When everyone is sharing close quarters and water is scarce, maintaining cleanliness becomes about preventing disease rather than personal comfort. You develop techniques for cleaning bodies and clothing without using excessive water or exposing people to dangerous cold. The psychological effects of prolonged shared warmth can be both positive and negative. The physical closeness provides comfort and security that helps people cope with the stresses of winter survival. But the complete lack of privacy can also create tensions and conflicts that threaten community stability. Successful shared warmth communities develop social protocols for managing these interpersonal challenges. Medieval children growing up in shared warmth situations developed different concepts of personal space and family relationships than children in more abundant circumstances. They learned to share resources, cooperate in survival tasks, and understand community needs as primary over individual desires. These lessons often shaped their adult behaviors and social values in ways that emphasized collective survival over personal comfort. The economic implications of shared warmth extend beyond immediate survival needs. Families that successfully pool resources for shared warmth often emerge from winter in better condition than those who attempt individual survival strategies. The shared costs of fuel, food, and shelter allow communities to stretch limited resources further than would be possible through individual effort. Tool and resource sharing becomes essential in shared warmth communities. Cooking implements, heating equipment, and survival tools become communal property during the winter months. You learn to coordinate the use of essential items so that everyone's needs are met while ensuring that tools remain in good condition for continued use. The transition from shared warmth back to individual living arrangements in spring requires careful planning and social negotiation. Families that have shared intimate quarters for months must renegotiate boundaries and redistribute resources as warmer weather makes individual households viable again. These transitions don't always go smoothly, and some shared warmth arrangements result in permanent changes to family and community structures. Medieval people developed sophisticated understanding of group psychology during shared warmth periods. They recognized that maintaining morale, resolving conflicts quickly, and ensuring fair distribution of resources were essential for community survival. Leaders often emerged naturally during these situations, people who could organize activities, mediate disputes, and make decisions that benefited the entire group. The shared warmth strategy also affected medieval concepts of hospitality and social obligation. Taking in additional people during harsh winters wasn't just charity, it was often mutually beneficial because more bodies meant more heat generation and more people to share survival tasks. But these arrangements also created obligations and debts that affected social relationships long after winter ended. Food preparation and consumption in shared warmth situations require coordination and cooperation that goes beyond simple meal planning. You learn to cook for larger groups using minimal fuel, share limited food supplies fairly, and time meals to provide maximum warming benefit. The social rituals around shared meals become essential for maintaining group cohesion and morale. The medical care challenges in shared warmth communities require everyone to understand basic health maintenance and disease prevention. When someone becomes ill in close quarters, the entire community is at risk. You learn to recognize early signs of illness, implement isolation strategies that don't compromise warmth sharing, and provide care using whatever resources are available. Remember that firewood anxiety we experienced earlier? Well, the shared warmth strategy actually helps address fuel conservation by maximizing the warming benefit of every log burned. But it also creates new challenges around resource allocation and decision-making that require community cooperation and sophisticated social organization. As winter continues and the shared warmth strategy becomes your new normal, you begin to understand how medieval people developed such strong community bonds and collective survival skills. When individual survival is impossible and community cooperation is essential, people learn to prioritize group needs over personal preferences in ways that modern individualistic societies rarely require or develop. February arrives with a vengeance that makes everything you've endured so far seem like a gentle rehearsal for winter's main performance. The storms that hit your medieval world during this period aren't just weather events theory natural disasters that can erase villages, kill entire families, and transform familiar landscapes into alien, Hostile terrain that challenges every survival skill you've developed. You wake one February morning to an eerie silence that experienced medieval peasants learned to recognize as the calm before catastrophe. The air feels different, thicker, more oppressive, with a strange yellowish quality to the light that filters through your cottage windows. Your animals are restless, pacing and making unusual sounds that serve as your medieval weather forecast system. When chickens refuse to leave their roosts and pigs huddle together making distressed noises, you know something terrible is approaching. The first blizzard of serious winter hits like a living entity determined to eliminate every trace of human existence from the landscape. Wind speeds that would terrify modern people armed with meteorological knowledge and emergency services become your reality without any warning system beyond animal behavior and folk wisdom passed down through generations of survivors. Snow doesn't just fall during a medieval blizzard, it attacks. Horizontal sheets of ice and snow driven by winds that can knock grown adults off their feet transform your familiar environment into a disorienting maze where directions become meaningless and landmarks disappear completely. The snow accumulates so quickly that paths you cleared hours earlier become impassable trenches that could trap and kill anyone foolish enough to venture outside. Your cottage, which seemed reasonably sturdy during autumn weather, now reveals every weakness in its construction as the storm tests every joint, beam, and connection with relentless pressure. The wind finds gaps you never knew existed, driving snow through cracks so small you wouldn't have noticed them during calm weather. You spend the storm's duration in constant motion, stuffing gaps with whatever materials you can find, repositioning containers to catch water from leaks, and praying that your roof can withstand the weight of accumulating snow. The psychological impact of being trapped in a small space while natural forces attempt to destroy your shelter creates stress levels that modern people rarely experience. You listen to the wind trying to tear your roof away, feel your cottage shake with each gust, and understand that your survival depends entirely on the structural integrity of a building you constructed with medieval tools and materials. Every unusual sound could indicate catastrophic failure that would mean death for everyone inside. But here's where medieval ingenuity and desperation create remarkable innovations. You learn to read the storm's personality like a survival guide. Different wind sounds indicate different threats. The steady roar means sustained pressure that tests structural integrity, while sudden gusts followed by silence suggest the storm is shifting direction and might be intensifying. The pitch of wind through gaps in your walls tells you whether the storm is increasing or beginning to subside. Ice becomes a particularly insidious enemy during February storms. It forms on everything: your roof, your walls, your windows, even inside your cottage if temperatures drop low enough. Ice adds enormous weight to structures never designed to support such loads, while also creating conditions where simple tasks become life-threatening challenges. Walking anywhere becomes treacherous, and falling on ice can result in injuries that would be fatal without modern medical care. Medieval people developed sophisticated techniques for dealing with ice-related challenges that would impress modern engineers. You learn to break ice formations before they become structurally dangerous. Understand how to create traction on icy surfaces using ashes, sand, or straw, and develop methods for preventing ice formation in critical areas like water supplies and animal shelters. Your water sources become major survival challenges during ice storms. Wells freeze solid. Streams become inaccessible under layers of ice, and even indoor water supplies can freeze if your heating isn't adequate. You learn to break ice with whatever tools you can improvise, understanding that access to water is essential for survival, but that the effort required to obtain it can exhaust your limited energy reserves. The relationship between storms and food security becomes critically important during February's harsh weather. Extended storms can prevent you from reaching food storage areas, accessing animal shelters where you might gather eggs or milk, or venturing outside to gather fuel for cooking. You must have emergency food supplies stored within your immediate living area, even though space is already critically limited. Animal care during severe storms requires strategies that balance animal welfare against human survival needs. Your livestock might be trapped in shelters that aren't adequate for extended severe weather, but rescuing them could expose you to deadly conditions. You develop techniques for providing emergency care to animals during storms while minimizing risk to human life. Here's a historical detail that illustrates medieval storm survival. Monastery chronicles from harsh winters describe monks using rope systems to navigate between buildings during blizzards, understanding that getting lost in whiteout conditions could mean death even when traveling familiar distances. One account describes a monk who became lost traveling the 30 yards between the dormitory and the chapel, surviving only because he found shelter against a wall and waited for the storm to pass. The heating challenges during severe storms become exponentially more difficult. Wind pressure can affect chimney draw, making fires burn inefficiently or even forcing smoke back into your living space. Snow and ice can block chimney openings, creating deadly carbon monoxide hazards. You learn to manage heating systems during storms in ways that provide essential warmth while avoiding asphyxiation or fire hazards. Historians still argue whether medieval people had effective methods for predicting severe weather or if they simply developed superior techniques for surviving unexpected storms. The evidence suggests both factors were important. Experienced peasants could read natural signs that indicated approaching severe weather, but they also had to be prepared to survive storms that exceeded their prediction abilities. Sleep becomes nearly impossible during the worst storms. The noise, a lone howling wind, creaking timbers, rattling shutters creates constant anxiety about structural failure. You develop techniques for resting while remaining alert to sounds that might indicate your shelter is failing, understanding that exhaustion can be fatal but that constant vigilance is essential for survival. The duration of medieval storms often exceeded what modern people consider possible or survivable. Blizzards could last for days or even weeks, creating situations where running out of essential supplies became inevitable regardless of preparation. You learn to ration everything: food, water, fuel, even movement, understanding that the storm will end eventually but that you must survive until it does. Communication becomes impossible during severe storms. Your nearest neighbors might be only a few hundred yards away, but they might as well be on another continent when blizzard conditions make travel impossible. Communities that seemed close-knit during better weather become collections of isolated families, each struggling to survive independently until conditions improve enough to allow contact. The cleanup after major storms presents its own survival challenges. Snow drifts can bury essential structures, making it impossible to reach food stores, animal shelters, or fuel supplies. You must dig out critical areas while conserving energy and avoiding overexertion that could lead to injury or exhaustion. The work required to restore basic functionality after a storm often exceeds the effort needed to survive the storm itself. Medieval people understood that storms created opportunities as well as challenges. Snow provided insulation for root cellars and storage areas, helping preserve food supplies. Ice could be harvested and stored for summer use, if you survived to see summer. Fallen trees created potential fuel supplies, though processing storm-damaged timber required tools and energy that might not be available. The economic impact of severe storms on medieval communities could be devastating and long-lasting. Storms that destroyed buildings, killed livestock, or ruined stored supplies created hardships that affected entire communities for years. Recovery from major storm damage often required community cooperation and resource sharing that changed social relationships permanently. Tool and equipment failures during storms become life-threatening emergencies rather than minor inconveniences. A broken shovel during a blizzard means you can't dig out essential areas. A damaged roof means exposure to deadly conditions. You learn to maintain and repair equipment using whatever materials you can improvise, understanding that tool failure during a storm could mean death. The relationship between storms and disease becomes apparent as harsh weather weakens immune systems and creates conditions where minor illnesses can become fatal. Being trapped in damp, poorly ventilated spaces with limited food and inadequate heating makes people susceptible to respiratory infections and other ailments that might be manageable during better conditions. Children and elderly people require special protection during severe storms. Their bodies regulate temperature less effectively than healthy adults, making them more vulnerable to hypothermia and exposure-related illnesses. You develop techniques for providing extra protection to vulnerable family members while ensuring that everyone has the resources needed for survival. The transition from storm conditions back to normal winter weather requires careful planning and gradual adaptation. You can't immediately resume normal activities after surviving a severe storm. Your body and your resources need time to recover. But you also can't afford to remain inactive when essential survival tasks have been postponed during the storm period. Medieval people developed remarkable psychological resilience for dealing with repeated exposure to life-threatening weather events. They understood that storms were inevitable parts of winter survival and developed mental strategies for coping with the stress and trauma of repeated near-death experiences. This psychological adaptation was as important as physical preparation for long-term survival. The knowledge gained from surviving severe storms becomes invaluable for future winter preparation. You learn which aspects of your survival strategy worked effectively and which areas need improvement. Each storm survived provides lessons that increase your chances of surviving future storms, assuming you live long enough to apply what you've learned. As February storms continue to batter your medieval world, you begin to understand why people who survived harsh winters were viewed with special respect in their communities. Surviving repeated exposure to conditions that could kill healthy adults in hours requires not just preparation and skill, but also courage, endurance, and a kind of stubborn determination that refuses to accept death as inevitable. Remember that shared warmth strategy we developed? Well, storms test these arrangements to their limits, forcing people to maintain cooperation and resource sharing under conditions of extreme stress and fear. The communities that survive severe storms often emerge with stronger bonds and more effective survival strategies, though many don't survive to benefit from these lessons. The knowledge that spring will eventually end the storm season becomes both a source of hope and a measurement of endurance. You count storms survived, calculate remaining resources, and try to maintain faith that your preparation and determination will prove adequate for whatever winter can still throw at your medieval world. As winter reaches its psychological nadir in late February and early March, you enter what medieval people grimly called the dark time, a period when the accumulated effects of months without adequate sunlight, nutrition, or warmth create a mental and physical state that challenges the very will to survive. The darkness isn't just about shorter days anymore. It's become a crushing psychological weight that affects every aspect of your medieval existence. Your world has been gray and dim for so long that you begin to forget what real sunlight looks like. The weak, watery light that occasionally struggles through heavy clouds provides little warmth and even less psychological relief. You find yourself straining to remember the feeling of summer sunshine on your skin, The way bright light could lift your spirits and make problems seem manageable. Now, even on days when the sun appears, it hangs low and pale in the sky like a dying ember that's lost the strength to provide meaningful illumination. The artificial light available in your medieval world does little to combat the oppressive darkness. Candles, when you can afford to burn them, provide tiny pools of flickering yellow light that seem to emphasize the vast darkness surrounding them rather than actually illuminating your space. Rushes dipped in animal fat burn with an unpleasant smell and create more smoke than light. Your fire provides the best illumination, but using precious fuel just for light feels like a luxury you can't afford when warmth is still a survival necessity. You develop what modern people would recognize as seasonal affective disorder. But in your medieval world, there's no understanding of this as a treatable condition. It's simply another survival challenge to endure. Your sleep patterns become erratic, with the long nights making it difficult to maintain normal rhythms. You might sleep fitfully for 12 or 14 hours, then find yourself wide awake during the brief daylight hours when you should be accomplishing essential tasks. The psychological impact of prolonged darkness combines with hunger and cold to create a perfect storm of depression that affects your ability to think clearly and make good decisions. Simple tasks that would be automatic during summer require enormous mental effort to complete. You find yourself standing in your cottage, trying to remember what you were planning to do, unable to maintain focus long enough to accomplish even basic survival activities. Medieval people understood that the dark months tested mental strength as much as physical endurance. They developed various strategies for maintaining psychological stability during the worst periods, though their methods were based on practical experience rather than scientific understanding of brain chemistry and light exposure. Some communities organized regular gatherings where people would share stories, sing songs, or engage in activities that provided mental stimulation and social connection. Your relationship with time becomes distorted during the darkest months. Days blend together in an endless succession of gray light and early darkness. You lose track of which day of the week it is, sometimes even forgetting how long winter has been ongoing. The lack of meaningful marker snow changing leaves, no growing plants, no variation in daily routines creates a sense of being trapped in time, as if winter might continue forever. Here's a historical detail that illustrates medieval understanding of winter depression. Monastery records from harsh winters frequently mention special prayers and rituals specifically designed to combat what monks called winter melancholy. These weren't just spiritual exercises, they were practical acknowledgments that prolonged darkness and harsh conditions created mental health challenges that required active intervention to prevent complete psychological collapse. The social dynamics of your community change significantly during the darkest months. People who maintained cheerful dispositions through early winter become irritable and withdrawn. Minor disagreements escalate into serious conflicts because everyone's emotional reserves are depleted. You learn to recognize the signs of severe winter depression in others: the vacant stare, the reluctance to engage in conversation, the gradual abandonment of personal hygiene and basic self-care. Children suffer differently during the dark months, but their suffering is often more obvious than adult depression. They lose interest in play, become clingy and fearful, and sometimes develop regression behaviors like bedwetting or inability to sleep alone. Medieval parents had to balance providing comfort for distressed children against the practical demands of survival that couldn't be postponed for psychological needs. The lack of variety in your daily routine contributes significantly to the psychological weight of the dark months. Every day follows the same pattern. Wake in darkness, tend the fire, eat a meager meal, complete essential survival tasks, eat another small meal, tend the fire again. Sleep. There's no entertainment, no stimulation, no break from the grinding routine of staying alive. Modern people who complain about boring jobs have never experienced the soul-crushing monotony of medieval winter survival. Medieval people developed some creative techniques for combating the psychological effects of prolonged darkness and monotony. Storytelling became incredibly important not just for entertainment, but as a mental exercise that kept minds active and provided psychological escape from harsh realities. People who could tell engaging stories or sing songs became valuable community resources whose contributions to morale were as important as food or fuel. Historians still argue whether medieval people suffered from winter depression to the same degree as modern individuals, or whether their different lifestyle and expectations provided some protection against seasonal mood disorders. Some evidence suggests that medieval people were better adapted to harsh conditions because they expected them, while other sources indicate that winter suicide rates were significantly higher than during other seasons. Your sense of smell becomes heightened during the dark months, partly because other senses are receiving less stimulation. You become acutely aware of the various odors that characterize your winter environment: the smoke from your fire, the musty smell of damp stone walls, the animal scents from shared living quarters, the staleness of air that hasn't been refreshed by open windows in months. These smells become so familiar that you stop noticing them, until occasionally a different scent, perhaps with smoke from a neighbor's chimney, reminds you of the outside world. The management of light becomes a survival skill that requires careful planning and resource allocation. You learn to time essential activities for the brief periods of natural light available each day, saving tasks that require good vision for the few hours when illumination is adequate. Activities that can be done by feel or from memory get relegated to the long dark hours. Your sleep environment during the darkest months reflects the harsh realities of medieval winter survival. You sleep fully clothed in shared spaces that prioritize warmth over comfort. The boundaries between sleep and waking become blurred when darkness dominates most of each day. You might doze fitfully for hours, wake to tend the fire, then return to sleep without ever experiencing what modern people would consider full alertness. Medieval people understood that maintaining hope during the darkest months was essential for psychological survival. They developed various techniques for marking the passage of time and reminding themselves that winter would eventually end. Some used simple counting methods, scratching marks on walls to track days. Others relied on religious observances or seasonal traditions that provided psychological anchors during the most difficult periods. The physical manifestations of winter depression become apparent as the dark months progress. Your posture changes, reflecting the psychological weight you're carrying. Your movements become slower and more deliberate, conserving energy but also reflecting a general decrease in vitality. Your facial expressions become more neutral, less responsive to external stimuli that might normally provoke emotional reactions. Food cravings during the darkest months become particularly intense, though your ability to satisfy them remains severely limited. Your body craves foods that would provide quick energy and psychological comfort: sweets, fats, anything that might temporarily relieve the grinding monotony of survival rations. The fact that such foods are completely unavailable makes the cravings more psychologically difficult to bear. The relationship between physical and mental health becomes starkly apparent during the darkest months. Poor nutrition weakens your immune system, making you more susceptible to illnesses that further drain your energy and motivation. Limited physical activity due to harsh weather and confined living conditions contributes to muscle weakness and general physical decline that affects mental outlook. Medieval communities that successfully navigated the psychological challenges of the darkest months often did so through collective effort and mutual support. They understood that individual psychological collapse could threaten entire communities, so maintaining group morale became a survival priority that required active effort and resource allocation. The transition between different phases of winter becomes particularly important during the darkest months. You learn to recognize subtle signs that conditions might be beginning to improve: changes in wind patterns, barely perceptible increases in daylight duration, animal behaviors that suggest approaching seasonal shifts. These tiny indicators of change become psychologically crucial for maintaining hope. Your relationship with memory changes during the darkest months. Memories of warmer, brighter times become both comforting and torturous. You might spend hours remembering summer days, the taste of fresh food, the feeling of being warm and well-fed. But these memories also emphasize how far your current reality has fallen from better times, sometimes making present conditions seem even more unbearable. The development of coping mechanisms during the darkest months often determines who survives winter and who succumbs to despair. Successful survivors learn to find small pleasures and sources of meaning even in harsh conditions. They develop mental exercises that keep their minds active, maintain personal routines that provide structure, and cultivate whatever social connections are possible given the constraints of winter survival. Medieval people recognized that the darkest months were temporary, but they also understood that the psychological damage inflicted during this period could have lasting effects on individuals and communities. Recovery from severe winter depression often continued well into spring and summer, affecting people's ability to plant crops, rebuild damaged structures, and restore normal community functioning. As you endure the seemingly endless succession of dark days and long nights, you begin to understand why medieval people viewed winter survival as a test of character as much as preparation. The physical challenges of cold, hunger, and inadequate shelter are obvious threats, but the psychological warfare waged by months of darkness and deprivation tests human resilience in ways that can't be measured in calories or degrees of temperature. Remember that firewood anxiety we experienced earlier in the winter? Well, by the darkest months, the psychological pressure of resource management combines with seasonal depression to create decision-making challenges that go far beyond simple survival mathematics. Every choice becomes weighted with existential significance when your mental resilience is depleted and your physical reserves are nearly exhausted. The knowledge that countless people have survived these conditions before provides some comfort, but it also emphasizes the magnitude of the challenge you're facing. Understanding that winter will eventually end becomes both a source of hope and a test of faith when each day feels like an eternity and spring seems like a distant fantasy that might never arrive. March arrives with the cruelest torture that nature can devise for medieval survivors who have endured months of unrelenting winter false hope. You wake one morning to find that the air feels different, carrying a softness that reminds your battered psyche of spring, and for a few precious hours, you allow yourself to believe that your ordeal might finally be ending. Then, just as your spirits begin to lift and your survival calculations start to include the possibility of relief, winter returns with a vindictive fury that seems designed to break whatever resilience you have left. These episodes of false spring become a psychological torment that's almost worse than the honest brutality of deep winter. At least during February's worst storms, you knew exactly what you were fighting. Now you're battling hope itself, learning that optimism can be as dangerous as inadequate fuel supplies when it leads to premature resource consumption or poor survival decisions based on wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment. The weather patterns of late winter create a roller coaster of conditions that test your medieval survival skills in entirely new ways. One day brings temperatures warm enough to melt accumulated snow, creating muddy, sloppy conditions that remind you of autumn's challenges, but with the added complications of depleted resources and weakened physical condition. The next day delivers a killing frost that turns the brief thaw into treacherous ice and reminds you that winter still holds the power to destroy everything you've fought to preserve. Your animals react to these temperature fluctuations with confusion that mirrors your own psychological state. Chickens might venture outside during a warm day, then find themselves trapped in suddenly harsh conditions when the weather shifts. Your pig, sensing the possibility of spring foraging, becomes restless and difficult to manage in confined quarters where it's been docile for months. Even your dog seems uncertain about whether it's safe to hope for better conditions. The false warmth of March days creates specific survival challenges that you never had to face during the honest cold of deep winter. Snow begins to melt, but instead of disappearing completely, it refreezes each night into ice formations that make navigation more dangerous than straightforward snow accumulation. You develop techniques for predicting when false thaws will turn dangerous, learning to read cloud formations and wind patterns that indicate approaching temperature drops. Food calculations become exponentially more complex during the false hope period. That temporary warm spell might trigger premature sprouting in your carefully hoarded grain supplies, forcing you to choose between eating seed corn meant for spring planting or watching your survival rations become inedible. You learn to protect stored food from temperature fluctuations that could ruin supplies just when you're closest to surviving winter's challenge. Medieval people developed specific terminology for the psychological challenges of late winter. They called March the lying month, because its promises of spring relief were so often followed by harsh relapses that could kill people who had relaxed their survival vigilance too early. Experienced survivors learned to treat warm March days as pleasant interludes rather than indicators that winter was truly ending. Here's a historical detail that illustrates the dangerous nature of false spring. Monastery chronicles from harsh medieval winters frequently describe March as the deadliest month for community survival, not because conditions were necessarily worse than February, but because people made fatal mistakes based on premature optimism about approaching spring. One account describes an entire village that celebrated an early March warm spell by consuming most of their remaining food stores, only to face 6 more weeks of harsh weather with inadequate supplies. The temptation to venture outside during false spring episodes becomes almost irresistible after months of confinement, but these excursions often prove dangerous or counterproductive. You might exhaust precious energy gathering firewood during a warm day, only to discover that the wet wood won't burn efficiently when harsh conditions return. Or you might attempt to check on cache supplies, only to find that the brief thaw has created flooding that makes your storage areas inaccessible. Your sleep patterns become even more disrupted during the false hope period as your body and mind struggle to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. The longer daylight hours that accompany March's arrival conflict with months of adaptation to winter's abbreviated days. You find yourself wide awake during what should be sleeping hours, then exhausted when daylight provides opportunities for essential tasks. Historians still argue whether the psychological torture of false spring actually increased medieval winter mortality, or whether it provided necessary mental relief that helped people survive the final weeks of harsh weather. Some evidence suggests that brief periods of hope and improved conditions gave people the emotional strength needed to endure winter's last assaults, while other records indicate that premature optimism led to fatal resource miscalculations. The management of expectations becomes a crucial survival skill during March's deceptive weather patterns. You learn to enjoy warm days without assuming they represent permanent change, to appreciate brief relief while maintaining the vigilance and resource conservation necessary for continued winter survival. This psychological balancing act requires emotional discipline that's difficult to maintain when you're physically and mentally depleted from months of hardship. Children react to fall spring episodes with excitement that's both heartwarming and concerning. They remember warmer weather and freedom to play outside, so brief mild spells trigger hopes and expectations that are likely to be disappointed. Managing children's emotional responses to repeated cycles of hope and disappointment becomes another survival challenge for parents already struggling with their own psychological resilience. The economic implications of false spring can be devastating for medieval communities. Merchants might attempt premature trading expeditions, getting trapped by sudden weather changes that make travel impossible. Farmers might begin spring preparation activities too early, wasting limited energy and resources on tasks that become meaningless when harsh conditions return. Your clothing strategies require constant adjustment during the false hope period. Layers that seemed appropriate for cold weather become uncomfortable during warm spells, but removing them completely could prove fatal when temperatures drop again. You develop techniques for rapid clothing adjustment that allow you to adapt to changing conditions without wasting energy or exposing yourself to dangerous temperature extremes. Water management becomes particularly complex during March's temperature fluctuations. Ice begins to melt during warm days, potentially providing access to fresh water sources that have been frozen for months. But the same melting can contaminate water supplies with runoff that carries accumulated debris and waste. You learn to predict which water sources will be safe during brief thaws, and which might cause illness that could prove fatal when medical care isn't available. The false spring phenomenon affects your relationship with time and seasonal expectations in profound ways. After months of winter, your ability to accurately predict weather changes and seasonal progression becomes unreliable. You might mistake a brief warm spell for genuine spring arrival, or conversely, you might become so conditioned to harsh conditions that you can't recognize when real seasonal change is beginning. Medieval communities often used false spring periods for essential maintenance and preparation activities that couldn't be completed during the worst winter weather. These brief windows of opportunity became precious chances to repair storm damage, reorganize storage areas, and complete survival tasks that had been postponed during harsh conditions. But the work had to be accomplished quickly, before conditions deteriorated again. The fuel management challenges during false spring episodes require sophisticated decision-making skills. Warm days might tempt you to burn less wood for heating, conserving your remaining supplies for future cold spells. But if you miscalculate and don't maintain adequate heat, the return of harsh conditions could catch you unprepared. You learn to bank fires efficiently during warm periods while maintaining the ability to quickly increase heat output when temperatures drop. Tool and equipment maintenance becomes critically important during brief periods of improved weather. The accumulated stress of months of harsh conditions often causes equipment failures during false spring episodes, when temperature fluctuations create additional strain on materials already weakened by winter's assault. You develop techniques for quickly assessing and repairing essential equipment during brief periods when outdoor work is possible. The psychology of hope management during false spring requires emotional skills that most modern people never need to develop. You must maintain enough optimism to continue survival efforts while protecting yourself from the despair that follows disappointed expectations. This emotional balancing act becomes another survival skill as important as fire management or food preservation. Animal behavior during false spring episodes provides important survival information, but interpreting these signals requires understanding how months of harsh conditions have affected animal instincts. A pig that becomes restless during warm weather might be responding to genuine seasonal change, or it might simply be reacting to temporary temperature relief. Learning to distinguish between animal responses to permanent versus temporary changes becomes essential for making accurate survival decisions. The transition between false spring episodes and genuine seasonal change requires recognition skills that can only be developed through experience and careful observation. Successful medieval survivors learn to identify subtle indicators that distinguish temporary weather improvements from genuine spring arrival changes in wind patterns, specific types of cloud formations, animal behaviors that indicated permanent rather than temporary seasonal shifts. As March continues its pattern of raising and crushing hopes, you begin to understand why medieval people viewed late winter as the most psychologically challenging period of the entire survival ordeal. The physical hardships of deep winter were brutal but straightforward. The emotional manipulation of false spring adds layers of psychological complexity that test human resilience in ways that pure physical adversity cannot achieve. Your resource calculations become increasingly critical as false spring episodes force you to constantly recalculate survival timelines. Each warm day makes you wonder if you can safely reduce fuel consumption, while each return to harsh conditions reminds you that premature optimism could prove fatal. The mathematical precision required for survival becomes complicated by psychological factors that make accurate assessment nearly impossible. Remember that shared warmth strategy we developed during the coldest months? Well, false spring episodes test these arrangements as people become restless and optimistic about returning to individual living situations. Managing community cooperation during periods when survival pressures temporarily decrease requires social skills that go beyond simple resource sharing. The knowledge that spring will eventually arrive provides hope, but false spring episodes teach you that timing is everything in medieval survival. Being right about seasonal change but wrong about timing can be just as fatal as being completely wrong about survival strategies. Learning to distinguish between genuine spring signals and winter's final deceptions becomes the ultimate test of medieval weather wisdom. April arrives like a cautious friend who's been away too long, uncertain whether they're truly welcome or if their presence might still bring disappointment. But this time, something feels genuinely different in your medieval world. The light carries a quality that penetrates deeper than the pale, watery illumination of false spring episodes. The air holds warmth that doesn't immediately dissipate when the sun disappears behind clouds. Most importantly, the signs you're seeing persist for days rather than vanishing with the next weather shift. You wake one morning to a sound you'd almost forgotten existed, the genuine dripping of sustained melting snow. Not the tentative, hesitant melting of March's false promises, but the steady, purposeful sound of ice surrendering to a warmth that finally has staying power. The icicles hanging from your cottage roof are retreating steadily rather than growing back each night, and the accumulated snow in your yard shows honest signs of permanent retreat rather than temporary tactical withdrawal. Your animals sense the change with an excitement that's infectious despite your months of learned caution. Chickens venture outside with increasing confidence, staying away from their roosts for longer periods and actually beginning to lay eggs with something approaching their normal frequency. Your pig roots around in the muddy patches with enthusiasm that hasn't been seen since autumn, and even your dog seems to remember what playfulness feels like. The psychological relief of genuine spring signals creates a euphoria that's almost dangerous in its intensity. After months of carefully controlled emotions and measured optimism, the possibility that your ordeal might genuinely be ending unleashes feelings that threaten to overwhelm your depleted emotional reserves. You find yourself crying at the sight of a green shoot pushing through melting snow, not from sadness but from relief so profound it manifests as physical release. But experienced medieval survivors know that spring's arrival doesn't mean immediate safety, it means transition to a different set of survival challenges. Your food supplies, carefully calculated to last through winter, are now critically low just when you need energy for the demanding work of spring preparation. Your physical condition, weakened by months of inadequate nutrition and limited activity, must somehow support the intensive labor required for planting, building repair, and restoration of normal life. The mud returns with spring's arrival, but this time it carries the promise of growing things rather than the threat of endless stagnation. You still struggle through ankle-deep mire, still lose shoes to particularly aggressive puddles, but now the mud means that soil is thawing and becoming workable. The same substance that represented obstacle and misery during autumn now signals opportunity and renewal. Here's a historical detail that illustrates medieval spring challenges. Manor records from agricultural estates describe spring as the hungry time of hope, when winter stores were exhausted but spring crops weren't yet available for harvest. Many medieval communities experienced their highest mortality rates during April and May, not because conditions were harshest, but because people's bodies finally gave out just when survival seemed assured. Historians still argue whether this pattern reflected the cumulative effects of winter deprivation or whether spring activities demanded energy that weakened bodies couldn't provide. Your daily routine begins shifting from pure survival maintenance to active preparation for the growing season. But this transition requires careful management because your depleted condition makes overexertion dangerous. You must balance the urgent need to begin spring tasks against the reality that your body lacks the strength and nutrition needed for intensive labor. Every activity becomes a calculation between necessity and physical capability. The search for wild foods becomes an obsession as you desperately seek anything edible that might bridge the gap between exhausted winter stores and eventual spring abundance. You scan every patch of ground for early greens, dandelions, wild onions, anything that might provide nutrition and variety after months of monotonous survival rations. The first wild foods of spring taste like delicacies beyond anything you remember from better times. Medieval people developed sophisticated knowledge about early spring foraging that often made the difference between surviving to plant crops and starving just as winter ended. You learn to identify plants that emerge earliest, understand which parts are edible and how to prepare them safely, and know where to look for wild foods that might be available before cultivated crops can be planted and harvested. Children emerge from winter's psychological cocoon slowly and cautiously, like butterflies unsure whether it's safe to spread their wings. Months of confinement and constant survival pressure have created behavioral changes that don't immediately reverse when conditions improve. They approach outdoor activities with wariness that reflects learned survival instincts, but gradually rediscover joy and curiosity as spring progresses. The social dynamics of your community change dramatically as spring arrival allows families to spread out from shared survival arrangements back to individual households. These transitions require careful negotiation because months of forced intimacy have created both strong bonds and serious tensions. Some relationships emerge from winter strengthened by shared hardship, while others require deliberate repair after months of survival-driven conflicts. Water sources, frozen or limited for months, suddenly become abundant as snow melts and streams resume normal flow. But this abundance brings new challenges: flooding in low-lying areas, contamination from runoff carrying months of accumulated debris, and the need to rebuild water management systems damaged by winter's assault. You learn to distinguish between safe and unsafe water sources as conditions change rapidly. Your seed supplies, carefully preserved through winter for spring planting, now face critical evaluation. Some seeds may have been damaged by moisture, extreme cold, or pest infiltration during the long winter months. Others might have been consumed during desperate hungry periods when immediate survival took precedence over future planning. The quality and quantity of available seeds will determine whether spring planting can restore normal agricultural cycles or whether another year of scarcity lies ahead. Tool maintenance becomes urgent as spring arrival demands intensive labor using implements that have been idle or minimally used for months. Metal tools show rust damage from winter's moisture. Wooden handles may have cracked from extreme cold, and cutting edges need sharpening after months of emergency use for survival tasks. Restoring tools to working condition requires time and materials you may not have while planting windows remain limited. The physical rehabilitation required after months of winter survival presents its own challenges. Your muscle mass has decreased, your cardiovascular fitness has deteriorated, and your joints may be stiff from months of limited movement and cold exposure. Attempting to immediately resume normal spring activities could result in injuries that would be catastrophic when you can least afford setbacks. Medieval communities often organized collective spring preparation activities that helped individuals manage the transition from winter survival to active agricultural work. These community efforts allowed people to share labor, tools, and knowledge while providing mutual support during a vulnerable period when individual capabilities might be insufficient for essential tasks. The economic implications of surviving winter create spring challenges that extend beyond immediate agricultural needs. Debts incurred during winter, food borrowed from neighbors, tools loaned for emergency use, fuel shared during crisis periods must be settled when everyone's resources are depleted. The spring economy operates on promises and future production rather than current assets. Weather prediction becomes critically important during spring transition periods because late storms can destroy early plantings and undo months of survival efforts. You learn to read signs that indicate whether apparent spring conditions are stable enough to risk precious seeds in the ground, or whether additional cold spells might require delayed planting that shortens growing seasons. The gradual return of wildlife signals genuine seasonal change but also creates new survival opportunities and challenges. Migrating birds might provide hunting opportunities for communities desperate for fresh protein, but they also compete for the same wild foods humans need for survival. The return of predators threatens livestock weakened by winter, while also indicating that natural systems are returning to normal cycles. Food preparation strategies shift from preservation and rationing to incorporating fresh ingredients as they become available. But this transition must be managed carefully because digestive systems adapted to winter rations may react poorly to sudden dietary changes. You learn to gradually introduce fresh foods while maintaining whatever preserved foods remain available. The psychological adjustment to spring's arrival requires managing emotions that have been suppressed or controlled for months. Relief, hope, excitement, and gratitude compete with anxiety about upcoming challenges, exhaustion from winter's ordeal, and uncertainty about future survival. Learning to experience positive emotions again becomes another aspect of spring recovery. Your relationship with time changes as days lengthen and normal seasonal rhythms begin to reassert themselves. The compressed daily cycles of winter survival expand into longer periods when productive work is possible. But you must relearn how to structure time around growth and development rather than mere survival maintenance. The assessment of winter damage to your property and possessions creates a sobering inventory of recovery needs. Buildings may have suffered structural damage from storms, ice, or neglect during survival periods. Fences need repair. Storage areas require cleaning and restoration, and numerous small maintenance tasks demand attention just when energy reserves are lowest. Medieval people understood that spring represented both salvation and new vulnerability. The end of winter's immediate survival threats coincided with increased energy demands and resource needs for restoration and preparation. Communities that celebrated too early or relaxed vigilance prematurely often faced spring disasters that undid winter survival victories. As spring establishes itself with increasing confidence, you begin to contemplate the magnitude of what you've accomplished. Surviving a medieval winter requires more than just endurance. It demands skills, knowledge, cooperation, and determination that test every aspect of human capability. The fact that you've lived to see another spring represents a victory that deserves recognition and respect. The gradual return to normal agricultural and social rhythms doesn't happen overnight. Recovery from winter's ordeal continues throughout spring and into summer as bodies heal, relationships stabilize, and communities restore functional operations. The lessons learned during winter survival become part of accumulated wisdom that improves preparation for future challenges. Remember that November countdown when winter first threatened your medieval world? Well, spring's arrival provides the other bookend to your survival story, proof that human determination, community cooperation, and accumulated wisdom can overcome even the harshest challenges nature can present. You've not just survived winter, you've learned skills and developed resilience that will serve you for the rest of your life. As longer days and genuine warmth finally drive away winter's last threats, you understand why medieval people viewed seasonal survival as a fundamental test of human worth. Not everyone who entered winter emerged in spring, and those who did carried knowledge and strength earned through the most demanding school nature could provide. The sight of the first green shoots pushing through soil that was frozen solid just weeks ago becomes a testament to life's persistence and adaptability. Like those plants, you've endured conditions that seemed impossible to survive, adapted to challenges that tested every limit, and somehow found the strength to continue when continuation seemed hopeless. Spring's arrival doesn't just mean survival, it means renewal, growth, and the opportunity to apply hard-won wisdom to building a better future. You've faced winter's worst and lived to plant another year's crops, to strengthen community bonds tested by hardship, and to pass survival knowledge to the next generation who will face their own seasonal challenges. And slowly, as warmth returns to your medieval world and life begins again in earnest, you settle into the gentle rhythm of recovery, knowing that you've survived something that many don't, armed with knowledge that can't be learned any other way than through the grinding, terrifying, ultimately triumphant experience of a medieval winter. Your breathing grows deeper and more relaxed as spring breezes carry scents of growing things instead of snow and ice. Your muscles gradually release the tension held for months of constant vigilance. Your mind, freed from the crushing weight of daily survival calculations, begins to remember what it feels like to plan for growth rather than merely endurance. The sounds around you shift from winter's harsh symphony of wind and storm to spring's gentler music of running water, bird songs, and the soft sounds of life awakening. Even in your drowsiness, you can hear the promise that spring carries, the assurance that seasons change, that hardship ends, that human resilience and community cooperation can overcome even the most demanding challenges. As sleep approaches on this spring evening, your last conscious thoughts drift toward gratitude for survival, respect for the strength you've discovered within yourself, and peaceful anticipation of the growing season ahead. You've made it through winter's trial by fire and ice, and now you can rest with the deep satisfaction that comes only from enduring the impossible and living to enjoy the rewards that follow. The medieval winter that once seemed like it might never end has finally released its grip on your world, and you drift toward sleep, surrounded by the gentle sounds and sense of a world coming back to life. Secure in the knowledge that you've faced nature's harshest test and emerged victorious, wiser, and stronger than you ever imagined possible. Sweet dreams await in your medieval world, where spring has finally come to stay, where survival has transformed into renewal, and where the warmth returning to the earth mirrors the satisfaction and peace filling your heart as you settle into the kind of deep, restful sleep that only comes to those who have truly earned their rest through endurance, courage, and the quiet triumph of simply refusing to give up when giving up seemed like the only reasonable option. The gentle warmth of spring sunshine filters through your cottage window now, carrying with it the sweet promise that your ordeal has truly ended. Your breathing slows naturally as your body finally releases the tension that's been your constant companion for so many months. The survival calculations that occupied every waking moment fade into peaceful memory, replaced by the simple satisfaction of knowing you've endured something extraordinary. Around you, the medieval world awakens with renewed life. Birds sing outside your window, water runs freely again, and the earth itself seems to exhale with relief as winter's grip finally loosens completely. You've witnessed something remarkable: your own resilience, your community's strength, and nature's inevitable return to abundance after even the harshest trials. The lessons of winter survival remain with you, not as trauma but as quiet confidence. You've learned that humans can adapt to almost anything, that communities grow stronger through shared hardship, and that even the longest, darkest winters eventually surrender to spring's patient persistence. These insights settle into your mind like gentle wisdom, ready to guide you through whatever challenges life might bring. Your eyelids grow heavy as spring's peace surrounds you. The desperate edge of survival has softened into the comfortable rhythm of recovery and renewal. Tomorrow will bring the joy of productive work rather than the anxiety of mere survival. But tonight brings the deep rest earned by those who have faced the impossible and prevailed. Let the sounds of returning life lull you towards sleep, water flowing, leaves rustling, the distant sounds of a world coming back to life. You've survived winter's medieval trial and emerged victorious. And now you can rest in the profound peace that comes from knowing you've discovered strength you never knew you possessed.